Chapter 6: Community and Contest. Styles in Conflict. When two people's paths cross, there is bound to be a conflict of interest. We can't both stand on the same spot without one of us standing on the other's foot. If no one steps aside, someone will get stepped on. You and I are not the same person, so some of our wants will be different, and conflict is inevitable. Because we can't both get our way, we may find ourselves in a power struggle. It may seem at first that conflict is the opposite of rapport and affiliation. Much of what has been written about men and women styles claims that men are competitive and prone to conflict, whereas female are cooperative and given to affiliation. But being in conflict also means being involved with each other. Although it is true that many women are more comfortable using language to express rapport, whereas many men are more comfortable using it for self-display. The situation is really more complicated than that, because self-display, when part of a mutual struggle, is also a kind of bonding, and conflict may be valued as a way of creating involvement with others. To most women, conflict is a threat to connection, to be avoided at all costs. Disputes are preferably settled without direct confrontation. But to many men, conflict is the necessary means by which status is negotiated, so it is to be accepted and may even be sought, embraced, and enjoyed. Walter Ong, a scholar of cultural linguistics, shows in his book Fighting for Life that adversativeness, pitting one's needs, wants, or skills against those of others, is an essential part of being human. But conspicuous or expressed adversativeness is a larger element in the lives of males than of females. He demonstrates that male behavior typically entails contest, which includes combat, struggle, conflict, competition, and contention. Pervasive in male behavior is ritual combat, typified by rough play and sports. Female, on the other hand, are more likely to use intermediaries or to fight for real rather than ritualized purposes. Friendship among men often has a large element of friendly aggression, which women are likely to mistake for the real thing. Ong demonstrates the inextricable relationship between oral performance and agonistic relations. Oral disputation to oral debate, from formal debate to the study of formal logic, is inherently adversative. With this in mind, we can see that the inclination of many men to expect arguments and discussions in daily conversations to adhere to rules of logic is a remnant of this tradition. Furthermore, oral performance in self-display, what I have been calling report talk, is part of a larger framework in which many men approach life as a contest. Because their imaginations are not captured by ritualized combat, women are inclined to misinterpret and be puzzled by the adversativeness of many men's ways of speaking and miss the ritual nature of friendly aggression. At the same time, the enactment of community can be ritualized just as easily as the enactment of combat. The appearance of community among women may mask power struggles, and the appearance of sameness may mask profound differences in points of view. Men can be as confused by women's verbal rituals as women are by men's. Such confusions abound in the verbal lives of couples. Don't tell me what to do. A woman I will call Diana often begins statements with let's. She might say, let's go out for brunch today, or let's clean up now before we start lunch. This makes Nathan angry. He feels she is ordering him around, telling him what to do. Diana cannot understand why he takes it that way. It is obvious to her that she is making suggestions, not demands. If he doesn't feel like doing what she proposes, all he has to do is say so. She would not press her preference if she knew it wasn't what he wanted. Lorraine frequently compliments Sydney and thanks him for doing things such as cleaning up the kitchen and doing the laundry. Instead of appreciating the praise, Sydney resents it. It makes me feel like you are demanding that I do it all the time, he explains. Another man makes a similar comment about his mother. She praised him for calling her, saying, "You are a very good person." He felt she was trying to ensure that he call her regularly by implying that if he neglected to call, he would be a bad person. In their study of the private lives of American couples, Philip Blumstein and Pepper Schwartz quote a young man who, in discussing his sexual relations with his girlfriend, told them, "We were in bed, and she was saying, 'Do this lighter,' or 'Do this softer,' and I just told her I was making love to her, and she was going to have to let me do it my own way. You don't want to be feel bossed around." In all these examples, men complained that their independence and freedom were being encroached on. Their early warning system is geared to detect signs that they are being told what to do, even in so apparently affiliative an activity as making love. Such complaints surprise and puzzle women, whose early warning systems are geared to detect a different menace. Being on the lookout for threats to independence makes sense in the frame of an agonistic world, where life is a series of contests that test a man's skill and force him to struggle against others who are trying to bend his will to theirs. If a man experiences life as a fight for freedom, he is naturally inclined to resist attempts to control him and determine his behavior. This worldview has given rise to the concept of the handpacked husband. Many men resist any inkling that their wives want to get them to do things. Women's lives have historically been hemmed in at every turn by the demands of others, their families, their husbands, and yet women may complain of overbearing husbands. There is no parallel stereotype of a rooster-packed wife. Why not? Seeing people as interdependent, women expect their actions to be influenced by others, and they expect people to act in concert. Their struggle is to keep the ties strong, keep everyone in the community, and accommodate to others' needs while making what efforts they can at damage control with respect to their own needs and preferences. If a man struggles to be strong, a woman struggles to keep the community strong. Let's go back to the children. The misunderstanding between Nathan and Diana can be traced to habitual conversational styles typical of men and women, styles that take shape with the first words children learn to use at play. Diana's tendency to make proposals beginning with "let's" is not just idiosyncratic. Researchers who study children at play have found that girls of all ages tend to speak in this way. Psychologist Jacqueline Sachs and her colleagues studying preschoolers between the age of 2 and 5 found that girls tended to make proposals for action by saying "let's," whereas boys often gave each other commands. For example, in playing doctor, the little boys said things like "lie down," "get the hard thing," "give me your arm," "try to give me medicine." When girls played doctor, they said things like, "let's sit down and use it." Marjorie Harness Goodwin found exactly the same pattern in a completely different group. Black children between the ages of 6 and 14 playing on the streets of a Philadelphia neighborhood. The boys, who were agonistically making slingshots in preparation for a fight, gave each other orders. Give me the pliers. Man, don't come in here where I am. Give me that, man. After this, after you chop him, give him to me. Get off my steps. The girls who were making glass rings out of bottlenecks didn't issue commands. They made proposals beginning with let's. Let's go around Subs and Suds, a corner bar or restaurant. Let's ask her, do you have any bottles? Come on, let's go find some. Come on, let's turn back. Yule, so we can safe keep him. Let's move these out first. Other ways the girls proposed activities were with we gonna make a whole display of rings. We could. We could use a sawer to sand down the glass surfaces of the rings. Maybe. Maybe we can slice them like that. And we gotta find some more bottles. All these are attempts to influence what the others do without telling them what to do. At the same time, they reinforce the identities of the girls as members of a community. Children may be influenced by their parents' styles as adults are influenced by what they learned as children. Psycholinguist Jean Berko Gleason studied how parents talk to their young children and found that fathers issue more commands to the children than mothers do, and they issue more commands to their sons than to their daughters. Sociolinguist Frances Smith observed a similar pattern in a public speaking situation. Examining the practice sermons of male and female students at a Baptist seminary, she found that when referring to the verses and chapters in their exegesis, the men frequently gave the audience orders such as, "Listen carefully as I read Luke chapter 17." The women, on the other hand, rarely uttered imperatives but rather tended to invite the audience to participate, as in, "Let's go back to verses 15 and 16." Given this pattern, Nathan is not far off the mark when he hears "let's" as equivalent to a command. It is a way of getting others to do what someone wants. And yet Diana is also right when she says he should not feel coerced. The difference lies in the fundamentally different social structures of girls and boys and women and men. In the hierarchical order that men and boys find or feel themselves in, status is indeed gained by telling others what to do and resisting being told what to do. So once Nathan has deciphered Diana's "let's" as her way of saying what she wants him to do, his next step is to resist her. But girls or women find or feel themselves in a community that is threatened by conflict. So they formulate requests as proposals rather than orders to make it easy for others to express other preferences without provoking a confrontation. Not accustomed to having others try to bend their will simply to solidify a dominant position, girls do not learn to resist others' demands on principle, and do not expect others to resist theirs on principle either. It is not that women do not want to get their way, but they do not want to purchase it at the cost of conflict. The irony of interactions like those between Diana and Nathan is that the difference between men's and women's styles doom their efforts. The very moves that women make to avoid confrontation have the effect of sparking it in conversation with some men. Insofar as men perceive that someone is trying to get them to do something without coming right out and saying so, they feel manipulated and threatened by an enemy who is all the more sinister for refusing to come out in the open. "I'll be the doctor and you be the baby." These differences in approaches to conflict have many other ramifications in ways of talking as well. In her study of preschoolers at play, Sachs found that when little boys played doctor, "I'll be the doctor" was the normal stance. Boys wanted to take the doctor role 79% of the time, and they often got into long arguments about which boy would get this high status role. Others have found similar patterns. Linguist Elaine Anderson had preschoolers play out doctor-patient scenes with hand puppets. She too found that the boys wanted to take the high-status role of the doctor and generally refused to be the patient or the baby. The girls wanted to be the doctor only a third of the time. They often wanted to be the patient, the baby, or the mother. In Sachs' study, in the vast majority of cases, boys told each other what role to take. Come on, be a doctor. Girls, on the other hand, usually asked each other what role they wanted. Will you be the patient for a few minutes? Or made a joint proposal. I'll be the nurse and you be the doctor. Now we can both be doctors. We both can be sick. Or, okay, I'll be the doctor for my baby and you'll be the doctor for your baby. Many of these proposals, in addition to avoiding confrontation or telling others what to do, are creative ways of keeping the girls equal in status. Do these experimental studies, in which children played in a laboratory setting, accurately reflect how children play in natural settings? Evidence that they do appears in an article written by a father, Roger Kamenez, that begins, "My daughter Anya, 6, and her friend Rosemary, 7, were playing together in Anya's room. The door was ajar, and when I heard some cooing noises, I peeked in and saw that each child was holding a Cabbage Patch doll, cradling it in her arms. Now you change your baby," said Rosemary to Anya, "and I'll change mine." In reading this, I was struck by the symmetry of the girls' play. Rosemary was proposing that they both engage in the same activity at the same time. Instead of trying to cast Anya in the low-status role of baby, she reserved that role for the unprotesting Cabbage Patch dolls. Different social structures. Girls and boys' different ways of trying to influence each other's behavior reflect and create different social structures. In getting ready for their slingshot fight, the boys in Goodwin's study evidenced a hierarchical organization. The leaders told the others what to do. Giving orders and getting others to follow them was the way that certain boys got to be and stay leaders. A command, by definition, distinguishes the speaker from the addressee and frames him as having more power. In contrast, the girls' groups were organized in an egalitarian way. According to Goodwin, in accomplishing a task activity, even among 4 and 5-year-olds, all participate jointly in decision-making with minimal negotiation of status. By framing proposals with "let's" and "we," the girls implied that their group was a community, and the results of compliance would increase the power of the community, not the individual power of the person making the suggestion. Furthermore, the boys typically did not give reasons for their demands other than their desires. For example, a boy who took a leadership role made demands like, "Pliers! I want the pliers! Look man, I want the wire cutters right now." But the girls gave reasons for their suggestions. Sharon: "We got to clean 'em first, you know." Pam: "I know." Sharon: "'Cause they got germs." Pam: "Wash 'em and stuff, 'cause just in case they got germs on 'em." Not giving reasons for their demands, the boys reinforced their orders as moves in a contest. Compliance indicated submission to the authority of the leader, although submission is an act of cooperation insofar as it reinforces the smooth working of the group. But the girls' methods of getting their way worked differently. Not only did they give reasons, but the reasons were for the general good. The bottles should be cleaned so no one would be harmed by germs. When Pam collaborated by echoing Sharon's suggestion and also her reason, she appeared to be participating in the decision making rather than following orders. This does not, however, mean that there may not be a pattern in whose suggestions tend to be taken up, or that someone whose suggestions are frequently taken up may not feel personal satisfaction and gain prestige in the group. The different social structures that boys and girls maintained went along with the sorts of activities they preferred. Boys particularly liked to play openly competitive games such as football and basketball. Even for activities that were not competitive by nature, the boys often broke into teams to facilitate competition. Girls were not much interested in organized sports or games. They preferred whole group activities such as jump rope or hopscotch. Goodwin found that the boys ranked themselves according to skill at different activities, and often bragged and boasted about their abilities and possessions. Like the little boys in Sachs' study arguing over who would get to be the doctor, the preteen and teenage boys in Goodwin's study argued about status, about relative skill, and who had the power to tell whom what to do. The girls argued about their relative appearance, their relationship to others, and what others said about them, whereas boys boasted that they were better. A girl who acted as if she was better than the others was criticized for bragging or showing off. Boys not also commanded but also threatened and insulted each other. If they had a complaint about another boy, they tended to voice it in his presence. Girls' complaints, however, were typically voiced in the absence of the accused. The girls' preference to avoid direct confrontation resulted in behavior that is traditionally thought of in a negative way, talking behind someone's back. Expressing this negative view, one man remarked that girls sacrifice sincerity for harmony. The accusation of insincerity is commonplace in cross-cultural communication because culturally different individuals do not talk in ways that seem obviously appropriate. Sparking direct confrontation by expressing criticism may seem sincere to those who believe that confrontation reinforces camaraderie. But in a system where confrontation causes rifts, it would not be sincere at all, since directly expressing criticism and sparking a fight would send a meta message that one wants to weaken the bonds of friendship. You didn't say why. These differences in children's experience result in divergent expectations, assumptions, and attitudes that confuse adult conversations. For example, the following argument arose because a woman expected to hear reasons from a man who was not in a habit of giving them. Maureen and Philip were trying to set a date for a dinner party. Maureen: the only weekend we seem to have free is October 10th. Philip: that's the opening of hunting season. Maureen: well, let's do it Saturday or Sunday evening. Philip: okay, make it Saturday. Maureen: wouldn't you want to be able to hunt later on the first day of hunting? Philip, annoyed: I said Saturday, so obviously that's the day I prefer. Maureen, now also annoyed: I was just trying to be considerate of you. You didn't give a reason for choosing Saturday. Philip, I am taking off Thursday and Friday to hunt, so I figure I'll have had enough by Saturday night. Maureen, well, why didn't you say that? Philip, I didn't see why I had to, and I found your question very intrusive. Maureen, I found your response very offensive. Since Philip didn't give a reason for choosing Saturday, Maureen assumed he might be accommodating to what he perceived to be her preference, as she might have done, indeed as she was doing. She wanted to let him know that it wasn't necessary, and she was hurt by his objecting when she was being considerate. To Philip, being asked to explain his reasons feels like having to give an account of his time. He assumes that individuals watch out for their own interests, so her poking around in his interest is intrusive. Her efforts to ameliorate a potential conflict of interests actually sparked a conflict. A good knockdown, drag-out fight. Differences in attitudes toward conflict itself show up in daily conversations. Gail hates to argue. If Norman becomes angry and raises his voice, she is deeply upset. I can't talk to you if you are yelling, she says. Why can't we discuss this like mature people? Norman can never figure this out. To him, being able to fight with someone is evidence of intimacy. In contrast, the endless monotonous discussions that she values as a sign of intimacy are anathema to him. They just wear him down, whereas he feels fine after a good knockdown drag-out fight, which leaves her feeling weary and defeated. He regards such fighting as a form of ritual combat and values it as a sign of involvement, since only those who are intimately involved with each other argue. Many cultures of the world see arguing as a pleasurable sign of intimacy as well as a game. Americans in Greece often get the feeling that they are witnessing an argument when they are overhearing a friendly conversation that is more heated than such a conversation would be if Americans were having it. Linguist Deborah Tennon showed that in the conversations of working-class Eastern European Jewish speakers, both male and female, in Philadelphia, friendly argument was a means of being sociable. Linguist Jane Frank analyzed the conversation of a Jewish couple who tended to polarize and take argumentative positions in social situations. But they were not fighting. They were stitching a kind of public sparring where both fighters were on the same side. Greeks often show caring by telling people what to do. A Greek woman studying in the United States surprised and annoyed her dorm mates by asking them questions like, "Why are you keeping the refrigerator door open so long?" and "Why are you eating so little? You have to eat more than that." These questions would be common among friends in Greece and would be valued as a show of concern and involvement. To Americans, they are intrusive and critical. Her American dorm mates responded by calling the Greek woman "Mom." What she intended as a sign of intimate caring was taken as a show of status, characteristic of mothers talking to children. Sociologists William Cosro and Thomas Rizzo studied children in American and Italian nursery schools between the ages of 2 and 4. They found out that one of the Italian children's favorite activities was engaging in the kind of heated debate that Italians call discussion, but Americans would regard as arguing. The researchers described a typical instance of a routine that was played out several times a week when the children were supposed to be quietly drawing with felt marking pens. A boy, Roberto, makes a display of searching for a red marker. Making sure everyone at his table is watching, he tries and discards all the red markers at his table, then gets up and takes one from another table. The children at the other table either don't notice or more likely pretend not to notice. But before long, a girl at that table, Antonia, asks loudly, "Where's red?" and she makes a show of searching for a red marker and displaying dissatisfaction with all those she and her table mates can find. Then the drama begins. This is how Costro and Rizzo described it. Antonia slaps her forehead with the palm of her hand and shouts, "They robbed us!" This exclamation sets several things in motion simultaneously. Roberto looks up from his work and smiles at the other children at his table. They all catch his eye and smile back, signaling that they know what is about to happen. At the same time, several of the children at the third table look over to Antonia's table and then quickly over to Roberto's. Finally, at Antonia's table, Maria jumps up. points out to Roberto and shouts, "It was Roberto!" Immediately, Antonia, Maria, and several other children march over to Roberto's table. Just as they arrive, a girl at the table, Lusa, grabs 7 or 8 markers, including the one Roberto took, and hides them in her lap under the table. Once at the table, Antonia accuses Roberto of stealing the red marker. He denies it, challenging Antonia and others to find the stolen marker. As Antonia and Maria begin to look for the red marker, Bruna, backed by several other children from the third table, enters the dispute, claiming that Roberto indeed stole the marker and that Lusa is hiding it. Lusa shouts, "No, it's not true," but Antonia reaches under the table and grabs the markers that Lusa is hiding. At this point, there is a great deal of shouting, gesturing, pushing, and shoving, and the teachers must once again intervene and settle the dispute. These children are not squabbling over a red marker. There are more than enough markers to go around. As Cosro and Rizzo put it, they would simply rather argue than draw. And this seems to go for girls as well as boys in the Italian preschool. Fighting for friendship. Though discussion, loudly arguing for the fun of it, is enjoyed by both girls and boys in the Italian preschool, American girls and boys are less well-matched in their attitudes toward conflict. Boys are far more likely to express and create affiliation by opposition. Teasing is a way that boys show affection to girls by taking an agonistic stance. A common example is the classic scene in which a boy pulls the braids of a girl he likes. I don't know any girls who liked having their braids pulled, but if she likes the boy, a girl might prefer aggression to being ignored. This was the case with a Polish girl, Eva Hoffman, who recalls her childhood companion Marek in her book Lost in Translation. "I am in love with him. I can't stay away from him. Although sometimes he plays boyishly mean pranks on me. He drops an enormous stone on my head when I pass in front of his window, and once he tries to stuff me into a hole in the forest, which turns out to have been left there by the Germans and might still have some mines in it." Marek's playfulness was potentially lethal. Nonetheless, Hoffman recalls, "We talk to each other ceaselessly, and in games with other kids we are a team. In fact, in spite of these risky games we play with each other, I have a deep belief that his greater physical strength is there to protect me." For boys and men, aggression does not preclude friendship. Quite the contrary, it is a good way to start interaction and create involvement. A woman told me of her surprise when she was a member of a mixed group of students attending a basketball game at the University of Michigan. Although their tickets had seat assignments, the usual practice among students at this university was for spectators to take any seats they found. First come, first served. Following these unwritten rules, the students took seats in the front row of the balcony. Before long, a group of men from Michigan State University arrived, assuming they were entitled to the seats shown on their tickets. Finding people in their seats, they ordered them out. When the University of Michigan students refused to vacate the seats, a loud argument ensued in which the men of the two groups denounced and threatened each other, and the women sank down in their seats. After a while, the visitors settled for the seats adjoining the disputed ones. Then the men, who had just been engaged in an angry verbal fight, began a friendly chat about the teams and the schools and the game about to begin. The women were dumbfounded. They would never have engaged in such an argument, but they assumed that if they had, it would have made them enemies for life, not friends in a wink of an eye. The possibility that a fight could be a way of initiating rather than precluding friendship struck me as a revelation when I read the transcripts in Khosrow and Rizzo's study. For me, observing the peer culture of the nursery school boys was like glimpsing a foreign world. Here, for example, is an episode they described among American preschool boys. Two boys, Richard and Benny, have been playing with a slinky on the stairs linking to the upstairs playhouse in the school. During their play, two other boys, Joseph and Martin, enter and stand near the bottom of the stairs. Denny, go! Martin now runs off, but Joseph remains, and he eventually moves halfway up the stairs. Joseph, these are big shoes. Richard, I'll punch him right in the eye. Joseph, I'll punch you right in the nose. Denny, I'll punch him with my big fist. Joseph, Richard, and he'll be bumpety and punched out all the way down the stairs. Joseph, I could poke your eyes out with my gun. I have a gun. Denny, a gun? Even if. Richard, I have a gun too. Denny, and I have guns too. And it's bigger than yours. And it's poo-poo down. That's poo-poo. All three boys laugh at Denny's reference to poo-poo. Richard, now leave. Joseph, I gonna tell you to put on the gun on your hair and the poo will come right out on his face. Denny, well, Richard, Slinky will snap right on your face too. Denny, and my gun will snap right. Up to this point, Richard and Denny seem to be engaged in a bitter fight with Joseph, who has tried to disrupt their slinky game. Denny introduces a humorous tone by mentioning poo-poo, which makes all the boys laugh. But they are still threatening each other. Khosrow and Rizzo describe what happened next. At this point, a girl, Debbie, enters, says she is bad girl, and asks if they have seen Robin. Joseph says he is Robin, but she says she is looking for a different Robin, and then runs off. After Debbie leaves, Denny and Richard move into the playhouse and Joseph follows. From this point to the end of the episode, the three boys play together. After an angry fight, in which they threatened to punch and shoot each other and snap the slinky in each other's faces, the three boys play together amicably. Not only did the altercation not prevent their playing together, it facilitated it. I suspect that picking a fight was Joseph's way of making contact with the other boys, and engaging Joseph in the fight was Denny and Richard's method of easing his way into their play. Making nice. Also intriguing in this preschool episode is the part played by the girl Debbie. It is her appearance in the guise of bad girl that occasions the end of the boys' verbal fight and their shift to playing together peacefully. Debbie seems to swoop down like bad girl on a peace mission. If the boys were creating an argument, girl manages not to say she disagrees, even though she really does. When Debbie says she is looking for Robin and Joseph says he is Robin, she does not reply, "No, you are not." Instead, she accepts his premise and says she is looking for a different Robin. The role of the female as peacemaker crops up again and again. In the following scene from the story, Volpen by Jane Shapiro, a daughter takes the role of peacemaker in a fight between her mother and brother. The fight erupts because of the mother's and son's differing focuses on intimacy and independence in the act of showing concern. In this story, the narrator is visiting her son, Zach, at college. He has been taking part against the university's investments in South Africa by sleeping in one of a number of shanties the students have built on campus. At dinner with his visiting family, which includes his sister Nora, his father William, and his grandfather Pep, Zach explains that he's frustrated because, in contrast to the administrators of other universities where students routinely get their heads smashed, The president of his college tolerates and even supports the student protesters, but does not exert pressure on the trustees to divest. Here is the voice of Zach's mother who is narrating the story. After a pause, I said, "Well, I'm sorry. You're not making more of an impression on the trustees. But speaking as a mother, there are times when I'm really glad you're not at Berkeley or wherever, getting your head routinely smashed." Zach gave me a curious look, and Nora sat back and gave me an amused one. As a mother, she said, "You usually try not to say that." By sitting back and reminding her mother that she usually tries not to speak as a mother, Nora seems to be trying to divert her mother from the conversational path she has embarked on. But the narrator continues with disastrous results. I said, "Well, I mean, I'm torn. Obviously, I support you and I'm proud of you. And I think it's important that you stand by your convictions. And obviously, I don't believe in trying to keep my kids from operating independently and doing what they think is right. At the same time, there's a part of me that says, I really don't want you getting smashed in the head." Although stagey, this sounded so reasonable to me as to be unassailable. William was supportively, absently nodding. "It's a conflict I've not resolved," I said, "and it's kind of irrelevant, Mom, whether you want to try to keep us from operating in a certain way." Zach said, "We're people. We're already operating. It's nice that you make an effort to frame it in a liberal way. But your idea, Mom, whether you should let us do it, is kind of, I don't know, not exactly germane." William then moves in to discipline his son in his wife's defense, and father and son are both angered. Nora steps in to diffuse the anger and make everyone friends again. Nora leaned and set her hand on Pep's forearm. She said, "Come on, guys." There was a silence in which Nora reached across to Zach's plate and picked up his last curled shrimp and said to him in a warm voice, "You want this?" He moved his head back and forth. Nora held the shrimp up in her fingers before popping it in her mouth and said, "This is undeniably a Vermont shrimp." She grinned at Pep. She said, "This shrimp regrets everything." When joking doesn't do the trick, Nora tries a direct appeal, softened with the use of a nickname that calls on her bond with Zach. "Come on, Z." Zach's angry reaction comes as a surprise to his mother. She thinks she is showing concern for him in the connection of spirit and caring, but he interprets her comments in the spirit of status and control. If she is allowing him to act on his own, then his autonomy is not real, but granted by her. Picking up on the superiority implied by protection, Zach reacts to his mother's framing him as her child. His father tried to settle this conflict by a show of power, reinforcing Zach's lower status. He tells the boy not to talk to his mother that way. But the daughter takes the role of peacemaker, trying to nuzzle Zach out of his anger by a show of bonding. Don't you agree? The role of peacemaker reflects the general tendency among women to seek agreement. When Marge tells John something she thought of or a comment someone else made, John often responds by pointing out a weakness in the position or an alternative perspective. This makes Marge vaguely uncomfortable. One day, she repeated someone's comment that echoed a point of view John himself had argued only a few days before. She was sure he would say, "Oh yes, that's right." In fact, her main reason for repeating the remark was to please John by offering support for his position. But to Marge's surprise and distress, John pointed out the other side. Even when she was sure she was sowing agreement, she reaped a harvest of disagreement. For John, raising a different point of view is a more interesting contribution to make than agreeing. But Marge finds his disagreeing disagreeable because it introduces a note of contentiousness into the conversation. For Marge, disagreement carries a meta-message of threat to intimacy. John does not see disagreement as a threat. Quite the opposite. He regards being able to express disagreement as a sign of intimacy. One man explained to me that he feels it is his duty when someone expresses a view to point out the other side. If someone complains of another's behavior, he feels he should explain what that person's motives might be. When someone takes a position, he feels he ought to help explore it by trying to poke holes in it and playing devil's advocate for the opposing view. In all this, he feels he is being supportive, and in a way he is, but it is support modeled on an adversative stance, a stance that is more expected and appreciated by men than by women. Enter the challenger. This difference in approach to agreement versus challenge comes up in educational settings too. A colleague had the students in his linguistics class read my book, "That's not what I meant," as a course text. He then set them the assignment of composing questions for me and sent me a dozen to answer. Of the 12 students whose questions I received, 10 were women and 2 were men. All 10 women questions were supportive or exploring, asking for clarification, explanation, or personal information. For example, they asked, "Can you explain further? Can you give another example? Are differences biological or social? Where do you get your examples? How will society change if everyone accepts your ideas? Why did you marry your husband?" The 2 questions from men were challenging. One asked, "In essence, your book deals a lot with psychology. Why did you reject the way a psychologist interrogated you at your seminar?" The other asked, "Doesn't much of the material in your book fall more easily into the realm of rhetoric and communication than linguistics?" The women's questions seemed charming to me, but the men's seemed cheeky. I remarked on the pattern to my husband. "Well, it was a setup," he commented. "How so?" I asked. "Well," he said, "their professor told them, 'Here's your chance. Here's the expert. It's a setup to challenge you.' So there it was again. He too thought it natural to challenge an expert. I, like the women in this class, think that the access to an expert is a chance to learn inside information and make personal contact. What then is the meaning of a challenge? I heard the men's questions as attempting to undercut my authority. Both seemed to be saying, "You aren't really a linguist," and one further questioned my interpretation on my own example. I didn't like this. I liked the women's questions better. I felt they reinforced my authority. I didn't even mind the intrusive one about my marriage, which allowed to be wry and amusing in my response. But challenging can be a form of respect. A male colleague commented that softball questions are pointless when there is a serious issue involved. Making a similar point, another male colleague commented with regard to a somewhat critical book review he had written, "In a way, you honor someone by grappling with him." Yes, her too. I was intrigued that both chose adversative metaphors from sports and combat to explain why challenging is obviously, to them, constructive in an academic interchange. I doubt I am unusual among women in seeing challenges as somewhat more real than ritual, and to take them personally as attempts to undercut my authority rather than to bolster it by grappling with me. It seems likely to me now that the young men who asked challenging questions were trying to engage me on an intellectual level. but they fell into a cross-cultural gap. I do not enjoy grappling when I feel personally challenged, though I certainly enjoy intellectual discussion if I feel my authority is respected. I would have valued their questions had they been phrased differently. Could you explain further why you objected to the behavior of the psychologist in your example? And could you expand on the relationship between your work and the fields of rhetoric and communication? A way similar questions have been posed to me is I agree with you, but I have trouble answering people who ask me why what I do is linguistics. How do you answer people like that? Someone who phrases questions this way elicits the same information but takes the footing of an ally rather than an adversary. Fighting to be nice. Since recognizing these patterns, I have been amazed at how often men invoke the theme of aggression to accomplish affiliative ends. For example, a guest speaker in one of my classes wanted to make the point that seemingly odd behavior could have many different explanations. To illustrate, he said, "Now take this young lady in the first row. Suppose she suddenly stood up and began strangling this other young lady sitting next to her." In reaching for an example of unexpected behavior, he just happened to think of attack. Another man was about to begin a workshop for about 30 people in a room that was large enough to hold 50. The audience had taken seats in the back, leaving a moat of empty rows around the speaker. When his initial request that they move forward produced no response, the speaker resorted to a teasing threat. "If you don't move forward, when you leave, I'll follow you out and kill you." A hypnotist was trying to help a woman retrieve her knowledge of Japanese, which she had once known well, but had forgotten since becoming fluent in Chinese. After inducing a light trance, he suggested, "Imagine that someone is speaking to you in Japanese, trying to push you around. Yell at them in Japanese, 'Get out of here!'" In trying to suggest an emotionally engaging situation, he hit upon one that is pivotal to most men. But I wondered and doubted if this would be particularly compelling for the woman. Later, in explaining his approach, he said, "Let's see if we can get the Japanese arm wrestle the Chinese and win." Wolf words in sheep's clothing. If boys and men often use opposition to establish connections, women and girls can use apparent cooperation and affiliation to be critical and competitive. Goodwin found, for example, that girls particularly liked a jump rope rhyme that allowed them to count how many jumps they were making. Gossip, too, can be competitive if one vies to be the first to know the news. Developmental psychologist Linda Hughes shows the subtle balancing of cooperation and competition among fourth and fifth grade girls playing a game called Foursquare. In this game, each of four children stands in a square drawn on the ground as they bounce a ball among them. Anyone who misses the ball, hits it out of the square, or bounces it twice is out. She leaves the game and the next child in line comes in. Although in principle the game is played by individuals, in practice these girls played as if they were on teams. They tried to get their friends in and others out. Hughes explains that girls played within a complex system that required them to be, in their own terms, nice and not mean. Getting people out was mean, but it wasn't really mean if it was done for the purpose of being nice to someone else. Getting a friend in. The girls had to be competitive. Always being nice and never getting anyone out would be mean to all the children waiting in line who would never get in. But they had to enact competition within a framework of cooperation. So, for example, a girl who was about to hit a ball hard and get someone out may call to her friend, Sally, I'll get you in. This announced for all to hear that she was not trying to be mean to the girl she was getting out. She was just being nice to her friend. The girls referred to this required behavior as being nice mean. They told Hughes they didn't like playing with boys because the boys just tried to get everybody out. Anthropologist Penelope Brown presents dramatic examples of how Tenayapa women use apparent agreement to disagree. Women in this main Indian community in Mexico do not openly express anger or fight. If they feel angry, they show it by refusing to speak or smile or touch. How, then, do they enact conflict when the situation requires it, for example, in court? Brown filmed a court case that took place following an unusual and scandalous incident in which a young bride abandoned her new husband and married another man. The groom's family sued the runaway bride's family for the return of the gifts that they had, in accordance with custom, given the bride. The two families were represented in court by the mothers of bride and groom. In presenting their cases, the two women argued angrily, by agreeing with each other in ironic and sarcastic tones. For example, when the groom's mother claimed she had given the bride a belt worth 200 pesos, the bride mother responded, perhaps it wasn't 100 or so. This ironically implied it was worth only 100 pesos. She also denigrated a skirt her daughter had received by saying, perhaps it's real wool then, perhaps, ironically claiming that the skirt was not made of real wool. The groom's mother countered, perhaps it's not that it was expensive then, implying that it was expensive. The other retorted, really expensive. It is itself then perhaps a question, sarcastically implying that it was cheap. Forbidden to express anger and disagreement directly, these peasant women expressed themselves in the manner that was available to them, the vocabulary of politeness and agreement. This example from an exotic culture may seem extreme, but the pattern is not so different from the ways modern women sometimes accomplish negative ends with apparently positive means. All the verbal ways of being nice that are expected of women can be used to hurt as well as to heal. A common way of hurting someone without seeming to intend to is to repeat a critical remark made by someone else with the for your own good introduction, I think you should know. For example, Hilda told Anna-Marie that Anna-Marie's sister-in-law had regaled a room full of women with stories about problems Anna-Marie was having with her teenage son. Anna-Marie was mortified to learn that her family problems were the topic of public discussion. Since she wouldn't tell her husband not to confide in his sister, and she didn't want to pick a fight with her sister-in-law, she felt there was nothing she could do but stew. Anne-Marie would not have been hurt had she not been told. So it was her friend Hilda who had hurt her, not her sister-in-law. To make matters worse, every time Anna-Marie met Hilda thereafter, Hilda gazed at her, brimming with concern, and asked, "How are you? How are things working out?" This made Anne-Marie feel like an emotional basket case rather than a normal parent whose children had normal problems. All forms of support can be used to undercut. Showing elaborate concern for others' feelings can frame you as the social worker who has it all together and them as your patients. Offering helpful suggestions can also indirectly imply criticism. For example, a woman named Sarah suggested to her friend Phyllis that Phyllis may ease her parents' next visit by having them stay in a hotel instead of in Phyllis's one-bedroom apartment. Instead of appreciating the advice, Phyllis correctly perceived that Sarah thought she was too involved with her parents. Praise can pack a wallop if it's hiding criticism in its pockets. For example, your new bow is fabulous. Like the last one seems to be praising your new bow, yet you walk away smarting from the slap to your old one. Similarly, the compliment, your presentation was excellent. It was much easier to follow than your last one, leaves you with a version of your audience scratching their heads over your last presentation. Another way that criticism can leak out without its author taking the responsibility for it is in speculating about others' motives. For example, Patricia was wondering aloud why a man she had met had not called her. Nadine had an idea. Maybe he thought you were stuck up because you told him you want to be called Patricia instead of Patty. Although Patricia still had no idea about the man's thoughts, she had learned what Nadine thought of her using her full name. Messages and meta-messages in fight. Though women may be reluctant to fight openly and men may be inclined to fight playfully, there are many occasions when men and women do engage in conflict, openly, seriously, and with each other. Often such arguments lead to frustration not only about the subject of dissension but also about the other's way of arguing. Once again, the difference between messages and meta-messages is key. A man told me about the following conversation which he felt typified why he found it frustrating to argue with a woman. The encounter began with her waking him up in the middle of the night. He, "What's wrong?" She, "You were taking up too much of the bed." He, "I'm sorry." She, "You're always doing that." He, "What?" She, "Taking advantage of me." He, "Wait a minute, I was asleep. How can you hold me responsible for what I do when I'm asleep?" She, "Well, what about the time?" She then took him to task for past offenses. It was hard for this couple to find a meeting ground in their dispute because they were moving on different levels. He was talking on the message level. He took too much of the bed. But she was focused on the meta-message level. The way he was sleeping showed that he took advantage of her generally, took up too much space in their relationship. She took the opportunity of this concrete offense to discuss the pattern of behavior that it represented. He felt it was unfair to pull a string of past events out of the hat of this inadvertent transgression like so many colored handkerchiefs in a magician's trick. Exactly the same points of view, similarly allotted, characterize in Anne Tyler's novel The Accidental Tourist. Macon and Muriel have been living together, but Macon is still legally married to someone else. Macon makes a casual remark about Alexander, Muriel's son. "I don't think Alexander's getting a proper education," he said to her one evening. "Oh, he's okay. I asked him to figure what change they'd give back when we bought the milk today, and he didn't have the faintest idea. He didn't even know he'd have to subtract." "Well, he's only in second grade," Muriel said. "I think he ought to switch to a private school. Private schools cost money. So, I'll pay." She stopped flipping the bacon and looked over at him. "What are you saying?" she said. "Pardon? What are you saying, Macon? Are you saying you are committed?" Muriel goes on to tell Macon that he must make up his mind whether he wants to divorce his wife and marry her. She can't put her son in a new school and then have to pull him out when and if Macon returns to his wife. The conversation ends with Macon saying, incredulously. But I just want him to learn to subtract. Like the man and woman who were arguing in the middle of the night, Macon is concerned with the message, the simple method of Alexander's learning math. But Muriel is concerned with the meta message. What would it say about their relationship if he began paying for her son's education? An argument that arose between a real-life husband and wife shows the same pattern. In this argument, which was recorded and analyzed from a different point of view by Jane Frank, a husband returned home and called his wife to arms. "How would you like to eat humble crow?" She had said it would be impossible to find a painting of a particular size and type that he wanted. Now he had found one, and he wanted her to admit that she had been wrong. Instead, the wife claimed that she had said it would be difficult, not impossible, to find. She proposed a compromise. She hadn't meant her remark as he interpreted it, but he would have none of it. She had said it, he had proved her wrong, she should admit defeat. Their argument, which became very heated, could not be resolved, because he never wavered from the message level, the literal accuracy of what she had said. But she moved on to what seemed far more important to her, the meta-message that his position sent about their relationship. "Why do you always try to prove me wrong and rank me out?" That reminds me of a story. These different worldviews shape every aspect of our ways of talking. One aspect that has been studied by anthropologists and linguists is storytelling, the accounts of personal experiences that people exchange in conversation. And the stories we tell and hear in conversations shape our views. Through hearing people tell what happened to others, we form assumptions about the right way to behave, and the ways that men and women talk about events in their lives reflect and create their different worlds. Each year, students in my classes record ordinary conversations that they happen to take part in, and transcribe a segment where people tell about personal experiences. One year, two students analyzed all the stories transcribed by class members to compare the ones told by women and those told by men. They found differences that fit in with the patterns I have been describing. The 14 stories that men had told were all about themselves. Of the 12 stories told by women, only 6 were about themselves. The others were about incidents that happened to other people. The men, but not the women, had told stories in which there were protagonists and antagonists. For the most part, the stories that men told made them look good. For example, two men told about times when they had won a game for their team by their extraordinary performance. Many of the women told stories that made them look foolish. For example, one woman told of not having realized she had broken her nose until a doctor informed her of the fact years later. Another told of having been so angry at losing her hubcap to a pothole that she stopped her car, searched in vain among a pile of hubcaps that had found a similar fate, and not wanting to leave empty-handed, took a Mercedes hubcap that was of no use to her. My students' informal comparison of the men's and women's stories had results similar to those of a study by Barbara Johnston of 58 conversational narratives recorded by her students. Johnston found that the women's stories tend to be about community, while the men's tend to be about contest. The men tell about human contests, physical contests such as fights, as well as social contests in which they use verbal and or intellectual skills to defend their honor. They tell about contests with nature, hunting and fishing. Stories about contests with people or animals can take the form of tall tales, which are themselves a kind of contest between the teller and his audience. When the male storyteller is not the protagonist in his story, the protagonist is a man. Men rarely tell stories involving women. Women's stories, on the other hand, revolve around the norms of the community and joint actions by groups of people. The women tell about incidents in which they violate social norms and are scared or embarrassed as a result, about people helping other people out of scrapes, about sightings of apparent ghosts which are then explained by others, about meeting their mates and acquiring their cats. The women tell about peculiar people, dramatizing about their abnormal behavior and setting it implicitly in contrast with social norms. They tell stories about themselves, about other women, and about men. In Johnston's study, not only did men more often tell about experiences in which they had acted alone, but when men and women told about acting alone, the outcomes tended to be different. The vast majority of men who reported acting alone also reported a happy outcome. The majority of women who reported acting alone portrayed themselves as suffering as a result. Only a very small number of stories told by men, 4 out of 21, had the protagonist receiving help or advice from someone. In a much larger proportion of the women's stories, 11 of 26, the protagonist received help or advice from others. Johnston concludes that men live in a world where they see power as coming from an individual acting in opposition to others and to natural forces. For them, life is a contest in which they are constantly tested and must perform in order to avoid the risk of failure. For women, Johnston claims, the community is the source of power. If men see life in terms of contest, a struggle against nature and other men, for women life is a struggle against the danger of being cut off from their community. Mutual misjudgments. These patterns provide a new context in which to place Thomas Fox's observations of the men and women in his writing, Class. Mr. H tried to exert influence on the group. Miss M tried to avoid standing out and offending. A large part of Mr. H's definition revealed his view of the world as an arena for competition and conflict. According to Fox, Mr. H's writing described competition and conflict with fellow students at West Point, where he spent a year with basketball teams and officials, with schoolmates, and most importantly, according to Mr. H, with his brother. If Mr. H appeared confident, his essays reveal the anguish he has experienced as a result of the antagonist world he inhabits. Since he is always in hierarchies, he has suffered badly in situations where he felt one down. In his brief military experience, where everyone conspired to make entering cadets feel like shit, and in his family, where he believed that his brother and sister were favored. Fox explains, Mr. H's essays are a litany of hierarchies, from the gradations of classmates at West Point to his description of a basketball game where the official unjustly penalizes the player, to the way he presents his family as a hierarchy of privilege with his parents at the top, followed by his brother, then his sister, and finally Mr. H at the bottom. All these hierarchies work to Mr. H's disadvantage, and as he states in a marvelously appropriate misspelling, they inferiorate him. In other words, what emerges as male confidence can be as much the result of past pain as what appears as female insecurity. Women and men are inclined to understand each other in terms of their own styles because we assume we all live in the same world. Another young man in Fox's writing class noticed that his female peers refused to speak with authority. He imagined the reason to be that they feared being wrong. For him, the point was knowledge, a matter of individual ability. It did not occur to him that what they feared was not being wrong, but being offensive. For them, the point was connection, their relation to the group. Both Mr. H and Miss M expressed dissatisfaction with the roles they learned to play. Miss M traced hers to her father, who cautioned her not to let on how much she knew. Mr. H blamed the agonistic world for casting him in his role. I personally used to be an open and very nice and sensitive person. Deep down, I still am. However, through competition with my family and relationships at school, I changed my personality, toughening up and shutting others out. Though opposition can be a means to affiliative ends, the hierarchical, competitive worlds of boys can also cause emotional pain and interfere with establishing connections. Different complexities. In responding to the differences between women and men described in this chapter, people frequently ask or tell me which style is better. Even researchers sometimes make value judgments. In comparing fifth grade boys and girls, 10 and 11-year-olds at play, Janet Lever concludes that the boys' games better prepare them for life in the world of work because boys' games involve more complex rules and roles. But girls' games also involve complexity in verbally managing interpersonal relations. Penelope Eckert, who observed boys and girls in high school, points out that boys define their social status in a simple and straightforward way: their individual skill and achievement, especially at sports, but the girls must define theirs in a far more complicated way, in terms of their overall character. Lever describes a game the fifth grade girls played that seemed monotonous to her. A large number of girls stood in a circle and together performed prescribed movements and recited a chant called Dr. Knickerbocker Number 9. One girl twirled in the center with her eyes closed, stopping with her arms extended. The girl to whom she pointed had to join her in the center, where she then twirled and picked another girl in the same way. When 9 girls were in the center, the ninth became the new number 1, and the other 8 returned to the circle. Why was this fun? Lever explains. Shouts of glee were heard from the circle's center when a friend had been chosen to join them. Indeed, a girl could gauge his popularity by the loudness of these shouts. In other words, the game is fun because it manipulates and plays off the commodity that is important to girls, the strength of their affiliations, just as the boys' games play out their valued commodity, skill. The girls' game is an experiment in shifting alliances. Indeed, their game is a contest, but not one of skill. It is rather a popularity contest. Marjorie Harness Goodwin and Charles Goodwin describe an elaborate verbal routine that is one of the main preoccupations of the preteen and teenage girls in the working class black neighborhood where they lived and worked. Called he said, she said by the girls themselves, this verbal routine is instigated when one girl tells another that a third was talking about her behind her back. The Goodwins remark that the males studied had no structure for extended debate of comparable complexity. So it is not that the boys' behavior is more complex in general. Rather, boys and girls are learning to handle complexity in different arenas. Boys in terms of complex rules and activities, girls in terms of complex networks of relationships and complex ways of using language to mediate those relationships. Whose way is better? Is it true that boys' games better prepare men for success in the work world? Surely the conviction that they cannot and should not act alone can be a hindrance to women who need to make quick decisions. But the conviction that they must act independently and always find their way without help is a hindrance to men, for there are times when they do not have all the information needed to make a decision. Furthermore, studies show that men and women who have been successful in the traditionally male fields of business and science are not very competitive. Rather, they excel in work competence or work mastery. They simply do their jobs extremely well. Women's inclination to seek agreement may even be an advantage in management. Many people feel that women make better managers because they are more inclined to consult others and involve employees in decision making. And everyone agrees that employees are more likely to implement a policy efficiently if they feel they have played a part in making it. One man described his wife's small business as an open arena in which people called her by first name, felt free to enter her office unannounced, and felt themselves to be a part of a group endeavor rather than underlings. In his own business, he said, his employees addressed him as Mr. and never entered without knocking, and he felt were less satisfied with their work situation. Though maintaining an atmosphere of community rather than hierarchy may have advantages in some settings, people who are not afraid of conflict have an advantage in inevitable situations where others try to get their way. Being willing to make a scene can be an effective form of power. Here's a trivial but telling example. The audience was sparse at a concert in a large concert hall. Many people were seated in the farthest balcony, but entire sections much closer to the stage were empty. So some of those in the last balcony got up and moved into the closer empty seats. An usher came in just as the crowd was resettling and the concert beginning. She chose a couple she saw reseating themselves, shined her flashlight in their faces, and told them to return to their own seats. The woman was ready to do as they were told, but the man began to shout angrily at the usher, who disappeared instantly, the only way she could put an immediate end to the loud disturbance. In another instance, a salesman boasted to his colleagues that he was one of the most powerful members of the sales staff. When he spoke at meetings, he was rarely crossed. He was proud of this, attributing it to his high status. In fact, no one crossed him because he was well known to have a quick temper and a nasty tongue, and no one wanted to be on the receiving end of his outbursts. The effect of fear is sometimes indistinguishable from the effect of respect. Women who are incapable of angry outbursts are incapable of wielding power in this way. Far worse, their avoidance of confrontation opens them up to exploitation. In a word, they don't stand up for themselves. Celebrity women are not immune to this pattern. Oprah Winfrey, for example, has said, "My biggest flaw is my inability to confront people. After all the shows I've done, the books I've read, the psychologists I've talked to, I still allow myself to get ripped off to the nth degree. It takes me days and days of procrastinating and agonizing before I can work up the nerve to say anything. Sometimes I think I'd rather just run out and get hit by a truck than confront someone who is ripping me off." This is not Oprah Winfrey's idiosyncratic flaw. It is a problem that innumerable women experience. In fact, it is not so much a flaw as a strength that is not working in oppositional context. Successful women may be especially prone to this weakness because they are likely to have achieved success by getting along with people, not by fighting with them. In order to get along with people and be liked, many women learn to avoid confrontation. But it is easier to rip off a person who is trying to avoid confrontation than someone who regards the world from an oppositional stance. One Sunday, I received a telephone call at home from a student who asked me a slew of questions about the dissertation she was writing. After spending a great deal of time answering her questions, I pointed out that she should really be putting these questions to her mentor, my colleague, who had primary responsibility and got primary credit for guiding her research. The student replied that she had to have answers to her questions that day, and she didn't want to disturb him at home. Why was it all right to disturb me at home on Sunday and not him, even though it was his job she was asking me to do? People find most women more approachable than most men. There are many possible reasons for this. Perhaps women's time does not seem as valuable as men's. Many of us can recall the feeling that our mother's time was at our disposal, but our father's time was reserved for more important pursuits outside the home. We had to wait for him to have time for us. So his time felt more valuable when we got it. But another reason for the greater approachability of women is their avoidance of conflict, which means they are less likely to respond harshly if displeased. Always taking an adversative stance can result in avoiding situations one might really enjoy, and always accommodating can result in accepting situations one would rather avoid. One man described to me what he and his former wife called the "I like chicken backs" phenomenon. When his family ate a chicken for dinner, someone had to eat the back, and in his family it was always his wife who assured others, "I like the chicken backs." But as this man commented to me, nobody really likes chicken backs. She had convinced herself that she liked chicken backs, broken egg yolks, and burnt toasts to be accommodating. But years of accommodating built up to mounting frustration that they both believed had contributed to their eventual divorce. Even among couples who do not divorce, accommodation can take a toll. Again, a celebrity provides an example. The actress Jane Meadows said in an interview that early in their marriage, her husband, comedian Steve Allen, had manipulated her into turning down major offers. For example, she said, "Steve kept me from the lead in Will Success Spoil Rock Hunter?" When questioned about this on a talk show, Allen said he had simply remarked, It's a little gamey, that opening scene, and Meadows herself decided to turn the role down. Jane Meadows apparently inferred, probably correctly, that her husband preferred that she not take the part. But did she have to honor his preference? At the time she felt she did, but looking back she wished she hadn't. And now for something completely different. For many women, openly opposing the will of others or what they perceive to be others' will is unthinkable. Ironically, it may be easier for some to think of leaving. This was the case with a woman I will call Dora, who did not realize until it was too late that opposing her husband's will not bring the house down. But the cumulative frustration of never getting her way did. A source of frustration for Dora was a series of used automobiles. It was she who drove to work and she who took the car to the garage, but her husband Hank who chose the cars they would buy. Hanks always went for cars that were cheap, interesting, and continually in need of repair. After Dora was nearly killed by a run-down Renault with unfixable brakes, they were in the market for yet another used car. Hanks fixed his sights on a 15-year-old Alfa Romeo that a mechanic he knew was getting ready to sell. Dora wanted to take advantage of the chance to buy a late model VW from a friend who was leaving the country. Determined to reach a decision by consensus, she tried every verbal resource she could think of to convince Hank that it made sense to buy the boring but dependable VW rather than the dashing old Alfa Romeo. But he would not be convinced. If this had happened at any previous time, Dora would have acceded to her husband's wishes and cursed him in her heart each time she drove the Alfa Romeo to work or the garage for repair. But this incident occurred when their marriage was already on the rocks. With so little to lose, she bought the VW from her friend and steeled herself for the torrent of anger she was sure she'd incur. To her amazement, Hank never spoke a word of remonstrance. When she told him what she had expected, he told her she had been foolish. She should have just done what she wanted from the start if she felt that strongly about it. He couldn't understand why she felt she had to have his blessings to do what she was certain was right. The most extreme example I have encountered of the conviction that accommodation is the best way to achieve domestic harmony came from a woman who talked to me about her early marriage to a man so violent that she feared for the lives of her children and herself. In explaining to me why she had tolerated his beatings, she said that her husband had had a difficult childhood, deprived of love, and she had felt she could heal his wounds and those of their relationship by providing him unconditional love. One time he beat her so badly that she was knocked unconscious. When she came to, he said, "I guess it's over." She replied, "I still love you." What he saw as a blow so vicious that it would surely drive her away, she saw as a chance to prove once and for all that her love was truly unconditional. Even with such provocation, she did not consider defiance or challenge to be an available response. No matter how dissatisfied people are with the results they are getting, they rarely question their way of trying to get the results. When what we are doing is not working, we do not try doing something totally different. Instead, we try harder by doing more of what seems self-evidently the right way to proceed. But when styles differ, more of the same is usually met with more of the same from the other party as well. As a result, far from solving the problem, our efforts only make things worse. This came out in the account of a couple, Molly and George. Molly can't bear it when George yells, but yelling seems only natural to him since he grew up in a home where he, his two brothers, and his father were always opposing each other, struggling and tussling and arguing. Occasionally, Molly surprises George by shouting back. She hates it, but he likes it. George explains, when I get angry about something and I attack, I expect resistance. If I don't get resistance, I get frustrated and then I get really angry. As this example shows, attempts to avoid conflict can actually spark it with someone for whom conflict is a valued means of involvement. An earnest American exchange student discovered this in conversation with his Spanish host in Seville. The host liked to talk against Catalans, members of an ethnic group living in northeast Spain, and she knew that her American guest did not share her views. Once she tried to provoke him by saying, "The Catalans are sons of bitches." The young American tried to be conciliatory. "Well, you have your opinion and I have mine, so let's not worry about it." Far from avoiding an argument, this refusal to engage in debate infuriated her and sparked on angry attack. They had to talk for an hour before coming to a partial understanding, not about attitudes towards Catalans, but about attitudes toward verbal conflict. In search of flexibility. When one's habitual style is not working, trying harder by doing more of the same will not solve problems. Instead, men and women could both benefit from flexibility. Women who avoid conflict at all costs would be better off if they learned that a little conflict won't kill them, and men who habitually take oppositional stances would be better off if they broke their addiction to conflict. Because people are different, not only in gender but in cultural background, differences in attitudes toward verbal opposition will persist among friends, lovers, and strangers. But they are particularly likely and particularly troubling in long term relationships, which are by nature affected by the issues of control and conflicting desires. Playing the relationship game together is harder if you are playing by different rules or playing different games. Since the meaning of conflict and the means that seem natural to deal with it are fundamentally different for women and men, this is an arena where men's and women's styles are especially likely to come into conflict. Simply realizing that what seems like unfair or irrational behavior may be the result of a different style helps to reduce frustration. Conflicts will still arise, but at least you will be arguing about real conflicts of interest rather than fighting styles.